Hi everybody, it's Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio, and today I have a quilting video for you. Today I am quilting on a 4-block sampler quilt. These are blocks from the vintage Quilt Blocks series, and they're 16-inch blocks, so I put 4 of them together into a sampler quilt, and I'm going to quilt them for you today. So I hope you'll stay around and I'll show you what I'm doing with this quilt. Today I'm working on the 4-block sampler quilt. This is actually sampler quilt number 4, and the block I'm working on here is the turkey and the straw block. Now this is a duplicate of the block that's in that first sampler quilt that I have online, and I just make a couple of them as I'm working out the patterns. So this block, I decided I wanted to quilt differently than the first quilt, so I'm doing some crosshatch in these big pink and green sections, and I've marked some landmarks at the halfway point, and I'm also using the piecing as a landmark there where the seams are. And throughout this quilt I'll be doing some cross hatching, a little bit of feathering, and some continuous curves. So those are the 3 designs that I decided to use, and it gives it a little more quilting than the sampler quilt, the first one. And this is going to be a wall hanging, and I think wall hangings look better and hang better if they have a little bit more quilting in them. So it's not going to be real heavy quilting, but it will be more than what was in that larger quilt that I'm using as a bed quilt. Now in these yellow sections I'm doing some straight line work. I'm just echoing it, and I'm going point to point. Now in the center I'm doing a feather, and I wanted to do feathers through this quilt in a couple of places, and in this block the center seemed to be the best place. However, I don't normally do feathers in busy fabrics like this because the quilting doesn't show very well. Now you can see it in the light, it casts a shadow and you can see it that way, but it's really not, it's not going to stand out on its own. You have to kind of work at it to see it. But this was a spin feather, and spin feathers go pretty quickly, so I didn't feel like I was putting a lot of extra time into that particular design. In the background I'm doing some continuous curve, and in the small triangles it's just the basic curve, and in the larger triangles it makes kind of a floral design, and it's just looks like maybe a tulip bulb that's starting to open. Now in the border, the outer border of this quilt, I do have a floral design in there. It's a large cabbage rose with some leaves and a couple of curls in there, but once again that is a busy fabric, so it doesn't show up that much. But that's kind of the cross pollination there of the floral design, is in those background triangles, and you'll see that throughout the quilt. Now the thread I'm using is an off-white, and it's an omni thread. So the off-white shows up a little bit more in the white sections in the background there. So instead of using a pure white, it blends it a little bit better with the print fabrics, and it stands out a little bit more in the background. So it's kind of a bonus both ways there. So this block went pretty quickly. This one didn't take very long at all. The longest part was figuring it out, and here's a photo of the completed block. Now this block is called 8 Hands Around, and it is a star and a star design with a triangle in each corner. So I'm doing my little spin feather in the center like I did the first block, and this one is a little bit smaller feather because the space is smaller, so I made each individual feather a little bit smaller. And I'm doing a continuous curve in the star points of the yellow star, and you can see how that goes pretty quickly too. Now for these large star points, since they are such large pieces, I decided to stitch in the ditch to help stabilize, And whenever you have large blocks, it does help if you stabilize some of that, either before you do the quilting or like I'm doing now. As I'm doing the quilting, I'm realizing that stitch in the ditch would be beneficial. It basically is helping those pieces stand out. And it's also stabilizing the blocks so that things don't shift and pucker while I'm quilting. So I'm just using my long ruler because those are kind of large spaces, and doing a little stitch in the ditch there. And now I'm doing some quilting within those star points. And what I'm doing is just echo quilting around that shape. So I'm doing 3 lines of quilting there. Where it's at, if they were smaller, I'd probably do 2. But since this is a larger piece, I'm doing 3 lines, and they're 1/4 inch apart. So it's just basically the width of the hopping foot. And I'll do that throughout each one of the star points. And that little ruler I'm using is called the Mini Scallop Ruler, and it's by Handy Quilter. And it's good for stitch in the ditch. It's a good size. It's between 6 and 7 inches long and about 2 inches wide. And it's got markings on there for distance at 1/4 inch increments. And those little flanges on the ends kind of help you line things up when you're doing stitch in the ditch. I've gotten to the point where I just kind of ignore those now because I'm used to that ruler, and I don't really need them, because after you've been quilting on long arm for a while, it's easy to judge where your 1/4 inch is, and you don't really need something like that to help you. But there are times when it does come in handy. So I use it on occasion, but not very frequently. And this block actually went pretty quickly too. Now, I didn't have this design worked out when I put the quilt on the machine. It kind of worked itself out as I was going along. I knew what I wanted to do in the outer border and in the sashing, and just went from there. And the sashing is cross-hatched, so that's where the cross-hatch is coming in within the block. So I'm just carrying the design from the border and the sashing into each block. Now, these square sections I'm doing, it's a continuous curve, but it is what I call crossed canoes. They're 2 oval shapes that are crossing over each other. And then I'm doing continuous curve in the triangles in that little tulip type design. Now, for the feather in this block, I decided to do it in the white background sections, so that way it shows a little bit more. And I'm doing the feather fairly large. It's not a fine feather. It's more of a large feather, and that way it doesn't take up as much time to quilt them in, and then it's not real dense. Even though I wanted the quilting in this wall hanging to be a little denser than what I would do on a bed quilt, I didn't want it to be real heavy quilting. So this is kind of a midway point. And now I'm just working my way around the block, putting in another feather, and just keep on moving. And then just keep going. Now, I was talking through this project. I've got my microphone on. That's that wire I keep moving out of the way. But the furnace kept kicking on, and all the audio was kind of cut up because of that. So instead of stopping and coming back in when the furnace kicked off, I'm just doing the voiceover. And it was just a really cold day. So there's that completed block. But on the days when it's really cold, the furnace runs a lot, and it's just hard to get anything done. I could work, 10 to 15 minutes, and then the furnace will kick on again. So it's just better if I do the voiceover. Now, this block is called Tulips, and I decided to quilt this one like I did the Jackson Star, at least these outer sections. Now this quilt block has a lot of pieces in it, and there are a lot of different ways I could have quilted it, but I think this one kind of emphasizes the design, so I think it turned out really well. And I'm just doing a point to point here in these sections here that are supposed to be the flowers in it, the tulips. I'm just carrying that on, just going from one flower to the next. And moving my tools out of my way so I don't run over them with the long arm. Now on this one, I debated on where to put the feathers in this one, and I'll get to that here in just a minute or two. But this is one block that could be really complicated with all the piecing in it, or you can make it really simple too. Just how, make it as complicated or as simple as you like. I'm doing a spin feather in the center. I decided to carry that theme out since the other two blocks already had feathers in the center. But these are a finer feather because the space is smaller. So it's another spin feather, and it goes really quickly. And on this background section, I'm doing an outline stitch. It's a 1/4 inch outline, and at this point I'm debating if I want to put a feather in here or not. And I decided to go ahead and do it, but I kind of put it off to do it a little bit later because I'm just not real certain what I want to do in here. But I did know that this space would look good being outlined. It would kind of showcase it a little bit better. So I'm outlining it on both sides, so on the outside and then on the inside here around this little square in the center. And then I'm going to work on the background while I think about whether or not I want to put a feather in there. And the debate on that is that not that it was going to take a long time, but that it could have been complicated because it's not a regular shape. It's not square, it's not rectangular, it's not a triangle, it's not a circle. It's got a lot of points in it, and the feather needs to be evenly distributed in there. So it would take some concentration to get that in there and have it look good. So I'm kind of debating on whether I want to concentrate that much on that section of the block. But in the end, I decided that would be the best thing for the block, so I go ahead and do it. And I'll get to that in just a minute. And I'm just want to finish up the background here while I'm arguing with myself on whether or not I'm going to go to the trouble of putting a feather in there. And if I hadn't put a feather, I don't know what I would have put in there. It's that was one thing I just couldn't think of anything else to do, which is a big incentive to just go ahead and do what I could think of doing. Now there are a lot of different ways to do continuous curve. There's lots of patterns you can use. I just am using the basic curve here, and it's effective and it looks nice. It doesn't have to be fancy. This is just one of my own little quilt projects here. And now I'm doing the feather in that section, and I'm using the center as the spine of the feather. So I'm not quilting in an additional spine or anything, and it's not a, feathers going on two sides of the spine. It's just a one-sided feather. And these feathers are a little bit smaller also because the space is narrower, at least in some parts. In some parts, it's very narrow. In other parts, when you get into those big triangles, you've got a little bit more space. But it was important that those feathers be pretty consistent. And that is the finished block there. Okay, Lena's Choice is the next block. And this was probably the most complex of all the blocks. As far as piecing and quilting both. But I decided to carry on the same theme and do continuous curve and feathers and some cross hatching. They're just in different locations. The feather is still in the center like the other blocks, so that made some consistency throughout the whole quilt. And once again, this is a print, which normally I don't do feathers in prints, except for the spin feather, since that is a simple feather to do. And then doing some continuous curve. Now the piecing in this block, the red part of it, to me looks like a bow with, ribbons on it. So I am outlining that red section, not only to emphasize it, but it needed something to tack it down, because there are a lot of seams that are coming together in points in this block. And in those areas where all those seams are, they want to stand out if they're not tacked down by stitching in the ditch. So I went ahead and did that, and then just went on with the regular design. I'm doing the crosshatch in the outer corners there in the squares. And I used a water-soluble pen to mark my landmarks, and I just had to mark them with a little dot. I didn't have to do a lot of marking. I could have marked all of the lines in there, but that would have meant doing a lot of work to get those out. I may have even had to soak the whole quilt to get all of those out, and I really didn't want to do that, because then I'd have to block the quilt and it just wouldn't look the same. So I just decided to just use little dots. As long as I could see them, then that's all it needed. And here I'm doing more stitch in the ditch around the red sections. And I think this block would be very interesting in a quilt with several of these in there, like an entire quilt made of these blocks. I think it would have a really interesting look. But it's not a quilt I plan to make anytime soon anyway. So I think I'm just about done with the stitch in the ditch here. I'm just stitching in the ditch on both sides of the red sections. And that helps tack everything down and keeps the block square. And you can see at that point I had trouble getting all over that little section because of all the points coming together in the piecing. And now I'm quilting the little bow, and those are just elongated triangles, and that just kind of helps emphasize the fact that this is kind of a bow shape piece here. And it's a busy print, and it doesn't show up that much, but the effect is there. And now we're doing more continuous curve in the white background triangles there. Just getting everything worked out. And as I said, I don't always have a full plan for the quilting when I start on a project. A lot of times it's got to be on the machine, and I have to start working on it before it all comes together. And that's kind of what happened with this. And in this section, I'm quilting a ribbon in there. So it's basically a serpentine line. It's two serpentine lines that are crossing over each other. So it's very quick and it's effective. So I think it turned out well. And there's one more. And then I have to do the blue triangles, and I'm just doing continuous curve in them also. And then picking up more of the background with continuous curve. So this goes all the way around. I didn't need to stop until I got to the end, but I did have to backtrack and get that one section there that I forgot one of the sides. Now on this block I did have a little bit of trouble with thread breaking. That's some of the gaps in there. It's because I had to stop and rethread the machine. And that's when I would hit those sections that had a lot of points coming together. Sometimes I quilt over the thread and I wind up cutting it with the needle. And so then I have to rethread the machine. And there is the completed Lena's Choice block. And here is the completed quilt. Thanks for watching. For more quilting ideas, click on the video links. And to keep up with my latest projects, click on the subscribe button. I hope to see you again soon.